You're listening to the SSPX podcast, and welcome to episode 38 of the Crisis in the Church series. Today, we'll be asking Don Tranquillo 3 questions surrounding the events in Rome from 2013. First, can a pope abdicate? Second, if he can, did Pope Benedict abdicate properly? What is required for this to happen? Did Pope Benedict leave us a hidden meaning or a coded message meant for the faithful to find during this process? And third, if this was all done properly, what do we make of the 2013 conclave that elected Pope Francis? There seems to have been some irregularities, to put it mildly, admitted to by at least one of the cardinals. So, is Pope Francis the Pope? One quick note on this interview: Father's microphone did occasionally cut out at times, making him a bit difficult to understand. We edited it for clarity, but it may be easier to watch this video on YouTube instead of just listening on the podcast. Well, with all that said, let's join Don Tranquillo right now on the SSPX podcast. Welcome back to our next episode on the Crisis in the Church series here on the SSPX podcast, and welcoming back Father Tranquillo, Don Tranquillo. Hello, Father. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. Nice to meet you again.
Yes, absolutely. It's always a pleasure to have you, Father. And in our past discussions with you, we've talked about collegiality, but then we talked about sedevacantism, and now we're going to talk about something kind of closely related to sedevacantism, sort of, and that is the question of whether or not Pope Benedict is still the Pope. It's kind of known colloquially as benevacantism, but that's not the official church term by any means. But wanted to start first with the abdication itself. First, Father, is it possible for a pope to abdicate being the vicar of Christ? Is it possible for this to happen? I guess we have to start with the basics there before we discuss any further.
Yes, sure. This was questioned at the beginning of, just after the abdication, somebody started to question that. But this is out, I would say, of ignorance, because you must know that the possibility for the Pope to abdicate is itself a dogma of the Church. So the Church has defined, as revealed by God, that the Pope is able to abdicate, to give up his charge. This was defined by Pope Celestine V, just before his abdication. Because obviously at that time too, people wondered if this was possible. So he started with this dogma, and then he abdicated. And this bull, this papal bull, was quoted by Pope Boniface in another one just after his election, Boniface VIII, successor of Celestine V. He said in this bull that he wanted to cut out, to amputate any kind of doubt about this question by his authority, apostolic authority. And he says, as my predecessor said in another bull that we don't have actually, he explained that there was this question before, and he said there must be no doubt, this is possible, and this is kind of dogma of the Church. By my authority, apostolic authority, I want to cut out any doubt, and so it's actually a definition. So there is no reason to doubt that this is possible. Then obviously this is in the laws of the Church. So whatever is in the canon law, the universal laws of the Church, is kind of infallible itself. That means that cannot contradict the dogma of the Church. So there couldn't be a law allowing abdication if this was against divine right. Now we always had this law, even before the code of 510, in the code of 1917, and in the new one. And then there is another simple reason: the Church has canonized Saint Celestine V and other popes who abdicated.
Sure.
That's very
important. And it is true, Father, that if once a pope is elected, he can refuse to take to take the papacy, and so it would just logically follow then that if he is able to refuse it, he's able to abdicate it.
Exactly. There you have the canonical reason, the theological reason, because this is a dogma, so you have to believe it. So you have to. The reason is that's one, because you have to accept in order to be Pope, to make a voluntary act. When you withdraw your acceptation, you are no longer the Pope. You are Pope not when you are elected, but when you accept election. In that very moment, the jurisdiction, supreme jurisdiction, flows unto you by our Lord. And yes, that's the reason. That's the very reason. Apparently, the only one, according to the doctors, that couldn't abdicate was Saint Peter, because it was bestowed the papacy by our Lord Himself. He has not to accept. It was just like that, so he couldn't give up. He was the only one, apparently. Now, to have a real abdication, obviously, it's enough to have a voluntary act. A free act, obviously, and voluntary. So you have not obviously to be forced by violence. If you take the hand of the Pope, make him write the abdication, but that doesn't mean that there must be absolutely free, like in marriage. Now, sometimes the Church or the law make this kind of acts invalid without consequences, obviously not moral consequences. So, for example, in the case of marriage, to avoid problems, if you are forced in that sense, even if you accept to be forced in some way, okay, you could die, but I don't want to marry anyway. I say no. But I die, but I say no. The Church, to avoid this kind of situation, declares void and null the marriage made in that way. For example, any other cases also in civil law. This is because the law wants that, obviously, for good reasons. But the case of the Pope is not like that. Even if he was forced by imagination, by some people, by situations, in the moment he says, okay, I accept to abdicate, I want to abdicate because there are situations or threats, whatever, I choose to abdicate, he chooses to abdicate. He does it. And there is no law, no positive law, making this decision void, because he's the Pope. He is not subject to any kind of positive law. It would be useless to have a law about that, because he's the Pope. He has no laws, positive laws, only divine laws, natural laws. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of the main canon scholars. They all say that in case of force, there is anyway the abdication is valid. We do not know, at least we do not have elements to say that the abdication of Pope Benedict was forced. There are some rumors, but rumors are not proofs at all. There were difficult situations, that's sure. Many difficult situations, even economical. It is true that the Vatican couldn't use the bank. That's true. That happened. I saw that in Rome at the moment, around the moment of the abdication. But we do not know, and there are no reason to believe that this was the reason for his decision. So it's just rumors. You cannot build something on that. And even in that case, it's not invalid. Yes.
Okay, so even in that case, so even if one were to believe the rumors, or let's say those rumors turned out to be true, that he was possibly blackmailed or something, not an issue.
This wouldn't be invalid according to, because, this situation of abdication is quite exceptional. The action will be anyway voluntary. And by natural law, a voluntary act is valid unless the positive law comes in to invalidate it. But this is not our case. So, coacta voluntas est. A will which is forced is still a will. That's what the principle says.
Okay.
So, anyway, this is just to remove something. But anyway, we don't know. And I don't think personally that there was such a pressure on him to force him to abdicate.
Sure. So we have seen that it is possible, both in a theoretical sense and also in this case, it is possible, and it's logically sound for it to happen. Is there a specific ceremony or formula or something that the Pope has to do in order to abdicate? And then the follow-up question would be, did Pope Benedict do this properly?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, very important, because there is no way, not a specific way to do it. What the canon law say, and is just an expression of the natural law, if you like. The Pope has to manifestate, to show this intention. He has to show it, to publicly say it in any way he likes. Because he is the Pope, he cannot be submitted to some kind of specific ceremony or procedure. It just has to make it clear to everybody. Because when your will is just within you, it has no consequences, not legal consequences, obviously. Moral maybe, but not legal. So he has to show it, to make it public in any way he likes. That's very important. Because this was questioned by some people, some lawyers in Italy. And this was rather... refined as an objection. They said that because he doesn't have a specific way to do it, every action showing that he didn't want to abdicate is important. So it's not enough what he said during the consistory, but you have to see everything he did, which I could agree, because this goes in our sense, actually, and we will see. But they try to like that to avoid some objection. So it's clear that Pope Benedict chose the classical way of abdicating. Classical, you cannot say classical because there are so few cases that you cannot say that there is a kind of common way to do it. But what Celestine V did, for example, was to have a speech in front of the cardinals in consistory. So that's what he did. The cardinals were there for canonizations. So before canonizations, there is always a consistory. One of the few consistories still existing. So he went there, and at the end of the consistory, he pronounced his renunciation, Latin. Now, first thing, somebody said that there are mistakes in the formula and the things he said in Latin, which is true in the sense that he pronounced not rightly some words. And in the first written text of this declaration, in the Osservatore Romano, there were the same mistakes. But there were two mistakes, two grammar mistakes, really. And then, some was not very elegant as Latin text. But, when the sense of the words is clear, principle of the law say that it's okay. It's enough that you understand the sense of what it said. Not everything is correctly pronounced or written even. Then the text published in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, the official text, is correct. It's correctly written. And all the translations that came out immediately were correct. And everybody understood what he was saying.
Right.
So the problem of the mistakes, the Latin mistakes in the text is not very important. But these people say, okay, it's not clear. What he says is not clear. So he has to clarify. He clarified, like, if we say, okay, this is not enough, every action can be taken in account to understand what he did. And then if we say this was not clear, this speech was not clear, which is not, but let's say that, let's concede that. Then we will see that he said very clear things. But it's enough, actually. What he said in consistory is more than enough. There is an objection about this text which seemed to be very clever, and this was repeated many times. And this in the in Italian press, you still have now in these very days articles appearing about that. But they say that he gave up not the papacy in itself, but the exercise of the power. So he said, "I'm still the Pope, but I do not do it anymore. So I'm still the Pope." And they say he used two different words to justify that. And so it's true that he said, I read, and then I tell you, I am aware, he said in his speech before the consistory, I am well aware that this munus ministry, munus is the charge itself, according to them. This munus must be carried out, and so on. And then he said, I have had to recognize my incapacity to adequately fulfill the ministry, and there he says ministerium, not munus as before. Then he say, I renounce to the ministry, the ministerium. He used two different words. He say there is a munus, and then I renounce the ministerium. These people wanted to say that these two things are different. So there is a munus, an authority you have. The ministerium would be the exercise of it. Use it, usually. So he gave up just one of the two things, according to them. Now, this distinction in the words is nonsense. The two words are often used by the popes, even the recent popes, as synonyms, actually. And there is a text where, for example, John Paul II says, the exercise of the ministry of St. Peter. So if ministry was always, has always the meaning of exercise, why to say the exercise of the ministry? No sense, reason. Actually, the two things are similar. You should use them in some specific context, distinguishing the two senses maybe, but that's not the case, because the sense of these words there is clarified by Benedict himself. What he says? Right. He says, I renounce the ministry, of Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, entrusted to me by the cardinals in 2005. So I renounce the ministry of Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. So just the ministry, as they say, or everything about it. So the charge is the authority. He says, I renounce the ministry that I was entrusted by the election. In which way? In such a way that, as from the 28th of February 2013 and at 8 p.m., the see of Rome, the see of St. Peter will be vacant. So I renounce the ministry. In which way? What does it mean? In such a way that the see of Rome, the see of St. Peter will be vacant. I don't think there is a doubt about the sense of these words.
Right.
And a conclave to elect the new supreme pontiff will have to be convoked by those whose competence it is. So he gives up the ministry of St. Peter, Bishop of Rome, and so on, in such a way that the see of Rome, the see of St. Peter is vacant, will be vacant. And then a conclave has to be convoked. Now, if you want just to give up the exercise of the ministry, you have to name a vicar of yourself, or some kind of vicar. I don't know if the Pope could do a complete delegation of his power. This could be discussed. Probably not.
Sure.
But anyway, he didn't do that. He said the see will be vacant and a new pontiff must be elected.
So if he only wanted to get rid of his ministry, his
authority,
right, then he would not have said the see of St. Peter would be vacant. But he said that. It's
the sense is clear because he said that.
Yes.
in the consistory itself, not just, even
Right.
afterwards we will see, but in the consistory itself, it says in such a way that what does it mean to give up the ministry, renounce the ministry? That the see of Rome is vacant, and you have to have a conclave. And then afterwards, just afterwards, it says, "Dear brothers, I thank you," and so on. And he asks for prayers, and it says, prayer to the Blessed Virgin, so that she may assist the cardinal fathers with her maternal solicitude in electing a new supreme pontiff. He asked for prayer, the new election, which it seems quite clear. But even if it wasn't, we have other things. We have other statements before he went away. You see that he announced his abdication, and he said that the see of Rome will be vacant on the 28th of February at 8 p.m. You can say this is a bit weird. Why not immediately? Because he wasn't under pressure. Yes, he had the time. He chose this way so that things could go smoothly in some way. Maybe that's probably the reason, so that they have the time. Now, on the 27th of February, there was the last general audience, with all the people in St. Peter's Square. It was the Wednesday. He said, Benedict said, "I do not return to private life, to a life of travel, meetings, receptions, conferences, and so on." That here there was somebody who wanted to use also that, because they say, you see, he want to stay there, so he's still something, is giving up the active ministry, but is spiritually the Pope, or something like that. Afterwards, also Bishop Genschwein, his secretary, said something about that, which was a cause of a lot of confusion. But there is a principle that we will use again, very important. Whoever is not clear in legal questions must be read in the light of what is clear, not the opposite. These people often, what they do when they say, "Oh, but he has white cassock, he has keys on his arms," or other things like that. A lot of these things. There are a lot of these things. There is a reason, but all these things are not clear. I agree, but you have to read them in light of what is clear, and not the opposite. What they do is to read what is clear in the light or the darkness, or to what is not clear. So they take ambiguous things, there are many in this application, to clarify, according to them, what is absolutely clear. And this is the opposite of the law, the opposite of the legal mind, if you like. Now, he said, "I am not abandoning the cross. I no longer bear the power of office for the governance of the church." Say, "I no longer bear the power of office for the government." If there is a word that in Latin I would use to translate this, is munus. The munus talked about, they say, "Oh, he didn't give up the munus, but just the ministerium." In these words, it says, "I no longer bear the power of office for the governance of the church." Power of office is exactly the munus. So he said everything. He was very clear in some way. Then he did a lot of weird things too. But what has to be said clearly was said clearly then, not after. I don't want to talk about afterwards, because abdication ends when he abdicates. Then it's just.
Well, and Father, I mean, if I could jump in and say, he may have done a lot of weird things, but it's also a very weird situation. I mean, broadly speaking, this is not common. So there are going to be weird things.
No, he did many things to make things a bit weird, because these things of keeping the white cassock and some titles and so on, this is not right. But it is, you can understand it, having listened to the episode of collegiality. Pope Benedict, or Bishop Ratzinger now, was one of the main tenants of the collegiality all his life. So this idea of papacy, which is not right at all, he kept it in mind when he abdicated too. I would say there is also something else. He did the first time of the rupture. When at the council, at the rupture with tradition, he was there and he did that. Then he stayed there as a cardinal and as a pope to put together all the new mass, but also old mass, one church, but also many churches. That was also collegiality. But then when you put together things after the rupture, you have to start a new rupture. That's how modernists work. Dialectic. Rupture, synthesis, and then rupture again. So to break again things, he abdicated. This kind of abdication, as he did it, was like the beginning of the new. He said that once in an interview. He said, they asked him after his abdication, but are you the end of the old or the beginning of the new? I say both things.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Anyway, this is just to understand the situation,
right?
Circumstances, if you like, but not the act itself. The act, the abdication in itself is very clear. And then he said in this same speech at the audience, I ask you, to the people, to remember me in prayer before God, and above all, to pray for the cardinals who are called to so weighty a task, and for the new successor of the Apostle Peter. May the Lord accompany him with the light and strength of the Spirit, which is obviously meaning that he is going to go away as a pope and have a new pope. I think this was repeated by himself in different languages, this request for prayers, even in English, in French, and so on, as they do usually. There are greetings in many languages, and in that case, the greetings were all about praying for the new successor of St. Peter and the Conclave and the cardinals, which is logical.
Right.
The day after was the day when he left. You remember the helicopter and all these things. He went to Castel Gandolfo, so to be away when there was the conclave would be convocated. So there was all this, how would you say, theater of the helicopter and so on. But before going away, he was in front of the cardinals in the Clementine Hall, and he had the speech to them, thanking them and normal things. And he said, before I say goodbye to each one of you personally, I would like to tell you that I shall continue to be close to you with my prayers and so on, especially in these coming days, that you may be completely docile to the action of the Holy Spirit in the election of the new Pope. It's a normal thing to say when you are going not to be Pope any longer. There will be a conclave. I pray for you so that you elect a good Pope. May the Lord show you the one whom he wants. And among you, it says, in the College of Cardinals, they were there in front of him, there is also the future Pope, to whom today I promise my unconditional reverence and obedience. I wonder how somebody could question his abdication after that. And there is more. It's clear that he is already giving his obedience to the new Pope by anticipation, which is a good thing to do.
Sure.
Then he left the helicopter. He went to Castel Gandolfo. And just before the time, at 8 p.m., he would cease to be Pope. People were gathering outside of the palace. So he went out. All these things are recorded. They are on the website of the Vatican, written in many languages. Everything it was spoken before thousands of people recorded. And he said, you know that this day is different for me from the preceding ones. I am no longer the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church, or I will be until 8 p.m. this evening, and then no longer. I am simply a pilgrim, beginning the last leg of his pilgrimage on this earth. He could have abdicated just saying that. This would be legally valid.
Sure.
This would be a legal abdication. Sure. You go out of the window in front of thousands of people and you say, at 8 p.m., I am no longer the supreme pontiff of the Catholic Church. Close the window, and that was. Perfect. It's an abdication made with everything you need. So if they do not believe at the consistory and everything else, they could believe at least the last things he said before 8 p.m. That's right. What he said, last thing he said. That's why all other questions are just irrelevant for the sake of the abdication as a legal act. For the sake of understanding the mind of Pope Benedict and his conception of papacy, they are very useful, very useful. All this question of white cassock, and you know that at the moment there is also, and then the things that were said by Archbishop Genschwein about the spiritual papacy. These things happened afterwards. They have no influence on the application, but they say something about his mind, which is not good.
Right.
Anyway, they do not change the legal act of the application. That would be another question. The conception of papacy according to Ratzinger. That's very important. But that's another question. That's not the abdication.
Right. So it's very interesting.
It seems
very interesting.
It's just that you do not have to listen to all these objections, but just to listen to him. What he said.
Right.
He made it clear. Even for them. So, yes.
I was just going to say, Father, and so therefore taking then the next step, I have seen people arguing, well, then the next conclave was not valid because there was a pope still living. But there was no pope still living.
Exactly.
Ratzinger is living, but the pope is not living. Therefore, the conclave proceeds like any other conclave, right?
Yes, that it is explicitly stated by the Constitution about the vacancy of the Apostolic See, that when the Pope abdicates, you do everything as when he dies. But this is normal. And Ratzinger says that when he asked to convoke the conclave by those who are in charge of it. But these people saying that, they are the same people who then explain to you why the conclave was invalid because of other reasons. But if the Pope was still living, as they believe, so you don't need to explain that the conclave was invalid for some reasons, because the conclave was invalid because of the Pope being alive and in charge.
Right.
But for some reason, maybe they are not persuaded themselves, I don't know. They want you to believe that Ratzinger is still the Pope and that the conclave was not good, not legal, for many reasons, according to them. Two things together. But you don't need to show me that the conclave was illegal if the Pope was in charge. You don't need to say anything else. The Pope was still in charge, Benedict is still the Pope, so conclave is invalid. That's all. But that they are not.
If that were true, then that's an easy argument.
Yeah, that's the only argument. But that's not enough for them. They want to show you more, to demonstrate more. So there have been many. In any case, if we have seen that the abdication is valid, if the conclave is not for the reasons they say, other reasons than the validity of abdication, in that case, obviously, we wouldn't have a pope. It doesn't mean that Ratzinger becomes the pope again. If the abdication is good, is true, is valid, the conclave is not, that means that we do not have a pope. It doesn't mean that Ratzinger becomes the pope again. That's very important.
Sure.
But obviously, the arguments about the invalidity of the election are quite also inconsistent. The main one, they say, is that about Cardinal Danils, the cardinal from Holland, who makes some statements in an interview to the television and also in a book he wrote. And he spoke about this mafia of San Gallen in Switzerland. They said that many times they gathered with some progressive prelates and cardinals in the Abbey of St. Gallen in Switzerland to talk about the future conclave in some way. This was also before Benedict. They wanted Bergoglio or some progressive after John Paul II.
Okay.
If this was true, and this was a reason to invalidate the conclave, so even Benedict wasn't the Pope. But because what he speaks about goes from the time of John Paul II, not only from the time of Benedict. So they were doing meetings even at the time of John Paul II. So the election of Pope Benedict would be possibly in the same condition as the election of Pope Francis, except that they didn't, but they couldn't reach their purpose, obviously, in 2005. Anyway,
Right.
What they say is, now, this cardinal says that they had meetings talking about who should be elected the Pope. Now, the constitution of John Paul II, this is traditional, quite traditional, about election of the Pope says that you must not have meetings and conventions about the election of the new Pope. This is forbidden. You have not to talk about, between cardinals, obviously, about the election of the new Pope and who should be elected before the death, abdication, of the present Pope. You have not to. And they also say there is an excommunication about that, so they are excommunicated. And the conclave, if you do that, is invalid. Now, there are three levels of answering to that. First one is the level of facts. Statements by Cardinal Danese are certainly not good things, but we do not know exactly what happened. You should investigate it. Understand exactly if this is the case which is forbidden, for example, or not. Because then he said names of people. And what about them? They should be able to defend themselves. If it is such a grave fault, they should defend themselves. You should ask them, is it the true? What do you say about that? Because otherwise, everybody could say, I sold the papacy, my vote, I bought. You can make accusations, and so immediately nobody is Pope. If this was true and this was invalidating the conclave, everybody could say whatever, and everybody would say, oh, so the conclave is invalid. But this is nonsense. These things must be seen as from the legal point of view and investigated, and so you have to see if it is true, in which measure, if this apply to the case forbidden or not, and so on. It doesn't. It's not enough to have a statement on the television, the Netherlands television, saying that we were gathering and we were like a mafia and so on. It's not good, but you cannot say that this is certainly what is forbidden, and so there are consequences at which ones, and so on. This is a bit too much. But then this is the facts. Are the facts as they are said by Cardinal Danese and so on? Maybe, or maybe not. Legally, it's not enough. But then, firstly, there is no excommunication for that. There existed an excommunication, late sententia, so automatic, so to speak, before Saint Pius X. So Saint Pius X made a reform of the conclave, and he left an excommunication that had to be brought by the Pope or whatever afterwards, if things were clarified. Before there was a late sententia excommunication, so it was you were immediately excommunicated if you did that. But then it was abrogated by Saint Pius X, and afterwards by Paul VI and John Paul II. there is no longer a penalty if you do that. You have not to do that, but there is no penalty if you do that. You're not excommunicated, or there is nothing. Maybe if there is an investigation, then the Pope would choose to punish you if he likes. But there is no longer no longer provided by the Constitution. So there is nothing about penalties. There is just the prohibition to do that, but not the penalty. And even if there is the prohibition, which is logical, that doesn't mean that if you do that, the conclave is invalid. So you have in the Constitution the rules to elect the Pope, how to vote, how many votes you need, and all these things. At the end of that, there is written, if you do these things, if you don't do these things properly, the election is invalid. Then you have another chapter with some other canons saying things that you must avoid in the election. You have firstly simony. You say simony, yes. So you have not to sold your vote for money or other advantages. And even in that case, since the time of Pius X, the election is not invalid, even if there is money in some way or some kind of simony. The Pope didn't want to make the election invalid to avoid, obviously, problems, accusations, and so on. And then you have this prohibition of conventions and agreements before the conclave when the Pope is still alive or in charge. Then you have that, but that doesn't invalidate the conclave. If you do that, it's not good. It's a sin, it's a fault, even a canonical fault, but there are no penalties, and this doesn't invalidate the election. So, firstly, we do not know what Cardinal Danis and others did, except from some statements by one cardinal, and then nobody was worried about that. The problem is also that if this was true or had to be investigated, the other cardinals should have said, stop, what is he saying? We should make an investigation about that, because this could be a problem. Right. But nobody was worried. So, legally speaking, canonically speaking, all of these things are without any consistency, without any relevance. So there is the facts are not clear. Even if they were, this wouldn't be a cause of excommunication. And even if it was, this wouldn't be a cause of invalidity of the conclave. So there is nothing about that to be said.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So even if, let's say you and I are both cardinals, God have mercy on us if so. Let's say both you and I are cardinals, and we are discussing and saying, hey, let's elect this guy, let's elect this guy. That it's obviously wrong, but that does not invalidate the election, even if we get our way.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And we are not excommunicated.
All right.
Yes.
Good.
Yes, so we are safe. Yeah. But when the Pope dies or abdicates, we can talk about that. It's written that we can talk about that afterwards. Okay. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that's fascinating. We've gone through, is it possible for the Holy Father to resign? How did it happen in the case of Pope Benedict? And, was the election then of Pope Francis valid? And to all cases, yes, it's possible. And yes. So I have heard, and this is, again, something I read online, of course. Someone said, well, if Pope Francis dies first, before Pope Benedict, what happens then? And the answer is another conclave, right?
Sure, yes. When you give up papacy, you cannot be Pope again unless he's elected. Pope Benedict Ratzinger will be elected by the conclave. Right. So he could be Pope another time, if he accepts. But otherwise, it's just a bishop. That's what it should be. Yes. Yes. So
that's what I figured. I just wanted to make sure I asked, because you never know. Things could happen.
If they elect him and he accepts, he's Pope again, yes. But I don't think that's very likely.
No, probably not. Well, Father, thank you so much for your time and for going through all of this with us. It was a fascinating discussion. And like you said a couple times, it's a very weird situation, but it's what we're living in. Yes.
It's something very, very rare within the life of the Church, an abdication, but we have to take it as it is. Then obviously there are theological problems, the conception of papacy, which are more important than the abdication itself.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Well, Father, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it very much. God bless you.
God bless you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to and watching episode 38 of our Crisis in the Church series here on the SSPX podcast. Next week on the Crisis series, we'll be speaking with Father John McFarland on the question of the validity of ordinations in the Novus Ordo. Since the ceremonies have been changed, are priestly ordinations and episcopal consecrations still valid? And should there be conditional reordinations to the priesthood if a priest has been ordained in the new rite? We'll tackle those questions and more next week. Please consider subscribing to the podcast and to the SSPX News English YouTube channel so you won't miss next week's episode or any of the future ones. And if you have the ability to set up a monthly recurring donation of $5 or $10 or $20 on sspxpodcast.com, it would help us immensely to complete this Crisis in the Church project and any future projects as well. Until next week, thank you for listening, and God bless you.